For most of the 17th century, the number of slaves in the American colonies is quite small. Indentured servants and the settlers themselves handle most of the colony's labor needs.
Now, this was a system that made sense when English labor was dirt cheap, as it was early in the 17th century, when the English economy was in such poor shape, and the English population was growing much faster than the economy. Plus, if life expectancy is short in the colonies, it makes more sense to buy somebody for 4 to 7 years of their life than to buy them for their entire life, meaning a slave.
You might say that the American colonists were the last to come to this notion that they could build their economy most profitably and fastest by bringing in Africans in very large numbers. And indeed, only about 5% of all the Africans brought across the Atlantic ended up in the American colonies. The numbers were gigantic to the sugar and coffee islands of the Caribbean, and to Portuguese Brazil particularly.
The central institution for modern slavery is the plantation, and the most lucrative crop that the plantation produces in the Atlantic world is sugar. The producers of sugar become the key players in modern history, and that means that everybody wants to be like them.
The transition from indentured servitude to slavery occurs first in the English colonies in the West Indies, when they hit upon successful cultivation of sugarcane. Once they develop that in the 1640s, they need a lot more labor. They need labor that they can work very hard, and they bring in Africans in very large numbers. The transition then in the Chesapeake occurs mostly in the generation from 1675 to 1700. At that time, the English economy is improving. There are fewer English people who are willing to sell themselves as indentured servants. At the same time, the cost of Africans goes down. So that it becomes, for many reasons, more sensible in the economics of tobacco plantations to invest in an African slave rather than an English servant after approximately 1675.
As a slave society develops in mainland North America, it's a different kind of slave society that develops in the heartland of Atlantic slavery, that is the Antilles, that is the Caribbean. It's not until the 19th century and the advent of a new crop, that is cotton, that the United States, now a separate country, becomes the great slave-holding society of the Atlantic world.
Unlike the indentured servant, a slave's departure from Africa is not a matter of choice.
And one of the things that makes the historical experience of African Americans so different from almost every other group of people that come to be called Americans is that they come against their will. You know, their journey, their travel, their migration is not by choice. It is what we call a forced migration. It's because they travel here as slaves. They were people who were either captured or sold into captivity.
Most of the agricultural work in Africa is done by women, particularly during 15th, 16th century when the Europeans first went to Africa. They were also very, very active in the market economy, since at least as traders and even as long-distance traders. But Europeans, when they went to Africa, they wanted to get 2/3 men, 1/3 women. But one of the things that they found often was that they couldn't get that ratio. Basically, they had to take women because the slave trade in Africa was literally controlled by Africans. And they determined who would be a slave and who would not.
They're mostly tribal rulers, local chieftains, who really are managing those coastal areas where the traders come. And they begin to understand very quickly that this works in terms of procuring certain kind of commodities and finished products that they don't have from European traders. And so an exchange pattern is set up. Sometimes it's war captives, tribes sending other people out that they really don't even think of as their kind of people. We can analogize it to the Protestant British selling the Catholic Irish, whom they did not see as part of their group. Or they might be people who were kind of a liability for their tribal or ethnic community, people who were criminals, people who were insane, people that we would now call mental defectives. It seemed to be a good way of getting rid of them.
If men were needed in a society for basically for protection and warring-based purposes, they would send women. So as laborers, African-American, at least African women, were quite desirable unfortunately, as slaves.
Planters who grow sugar as opposed to cotton, as opposed to tobacco, as opposed to rice, begin to feel that black people who come from particular parts of Africa make better workers. They adapt more quickly to the climate. The death rate is lower. The disease rate is lower. Or they have some sensitivity to the agricultural crop because it was similar to things that they were growing in Africa. So you'll have people from parts of what we now call Nigeria or Senegal or Ghana beginning to be settled, and I use the term advisedly because they don't have agency, beginning to be settled in certain parts of the United States more thickly than in others.